No, we are not wasting another operating room on a Terran. The words hit harder than the collision that had crushed Mason Carter's body beneath a collapsing gravitic stabilizer only 6 hours earlier. He was awake when the verdict came down. Awake enough to hear the quiet shuffle of specialists leaving his room as though the decision had already been made. The ceiling above him glowed with soft white medical lights while unfamiliar machines hummed around the bed, each one silently confirming the same conclusion. Beyond recovery. Mason tried to lift his hand. Nothing. Tried to move his legs. Nothing. Even drawing a deep breath felt strange, like his body had forgotten how to work. The automatic door slid open, and a tall figure in silver medical robes stepped inside. Dr. Cale Voss, director of the Galactic Cybernetics Institute, carried himself with the confidence of someone whose opinions had never been questioned. He stopped beside the bed and looked down at Mason with something that almost resembled sympathy. "Mr. Carter," he said calmly, "your nervous system survived. Your organs survived. Unfortunately, your skeletal structure did not. More than 80% of it has suffered irreversible structural failure. We have exhausted every approved reconstruction protocol." Mason stared at the ceiling for another second before finally asking, "So that's it?" "It is." Cale folded his hands behind his back. "You will remain comfortable. Your mind is intact. That is more than many patients receive after an accident like this." Mason let out the smallest laugh. "Comfortable isn't exactly how I pictured retirement." Cale didn't smile. Terran anatomy has reached its practical limit. Biology cannot negotiate with physics. The room fell quiet again until another voice broke the silence. "He's still here, isn't he?" Olivia Brooks stepped through the doorway carrying a tablet against her chest. Her dark blonde hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and she looked like she had not slept all night. She ignored Cale and walked straight to Mason. "Hey," she said softly. "You scared the hell out of me." Mason managed the tiniest grin. "I've looked better." Olivia looked toward Cale. "There has to be another option." "There is not," Cale answered without hesitation. "Our cybernetic lattice cannot anchor to what no longer exists." Olivia frowned. "Then build something new." Cale actually paused before replying. "Medicine restores what nature intended. We do not invent replacement species." He turned toward the exit. "The review board will finalize his status by morning." The door closed behind him. For several seconds, neither Mason nor Olivia spoke. The machines continued their quiet rhythm, measuring a future everyone else had already accepted. Finally, Mason broke the silence. "Liv, yeah. Can you pull up my scans?" She blinked. The scans. Every layer. Bone density. Structural mapping. Everything they recorded. "Mason, please." She searched his face, expecting fear or denial. Instead, she found the same look he wore every time an engine refused to start or a machine landed on his workbench in pieces. He wasn't mourning what had happened. He was studying it. Olivia slowly unlocked her tablet and hesitated. "You really think looking at those is going to change anything?" Mason kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "I don't want to see what they couldn't fix." He took a slow breath before finishing the sentence that would quietly change both their lives. "I want to figure out why everyone keeps trying to save the skeleton I don't need anymore." Mason barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the rotating three-dimensional scan of his own skeleton floating above Olivia's tablet. Hundreds of fractures. Entire sections highlighted in red where the medical system had simply labeled the structure beyond recovery. Any ordinary patient would have stopped looking after the first minute. Mason had been studying it for almost 5 hours. Olivia leaned against the wall with a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "You know every doctor in this station already gave you the same answer." Mason never looked away from the projection. "Doctors solve medical problems. And you?" "I solve mechanical ones." She sighed. "Your body is not a machine." Mason finally smiled. "Everything carrying a load is a machine." He reached toward the hologram, using slow finger movements to rotate the image of his rib cage. Every joint, every connection, every support beam built by millions of years of evolution. He whispered almost to himself, "That is the problem." Olivia frowned. "What do you mean?" "Everybody here keeps asking how to rebuild a human skeleton." He pointed toward the projection. "Nobody has asked whether this design is still the best one." Before Olivia could answer, the room lights dimmed. A hospital announcement echoed through the floor. "Attention! Cybernetic Review Board convening in Conference Chamber 7. Olivia looked toward the hallway. That is your hearing. Mason nodded. Help me sit up. You cannot even move. Then roll the bed. 20 minutes later, his medical bed entered a circular chamber filled with alien physicians, biomechanical experts, and government observers. Dr. Cale Voss stood at the center beside a floating display showing Mason's internal scans. His voice carried easily across the room. Subject Mason Carter. Structural survival probability after approved reconstruction remains below 3%. Recommendation: permanent neural support and mobility assistance. A council member with shimmering blue skin nodded. Accepted. Mason raised his hand just enough for the censors to notice. I would like to object. Several heads turned. Cale answered first. On what grounds? Incomplete engineering review. Quiet laughter spread across the chamber. One physician leaned toward another and muttered, "The patient believes he is on the design committee." Mason ignored them. You are treating structural collapse like biological failure. It is not. Cale folded his arms. Explain. Mason looked directly at the enormous skeleton model suspended above the room. You keep trying to copy what failed. Engineers do not do that. When a bridge collapses, we do not rebuild the weak support beam exactly the same way and hope gravity becomes more forgiving. The laughter stopped. Mason continued. We redesigned the load path. One council member quietly leaned forward. Cale remained expressionless. Terran engineering philosophy is not recognized by cybernetic law. That sounds like a paperwork problem. A few younger researchers exchanged surprised looks before quickly hiding their reactions. Cale dismissed the room with one wave of his hand. This discussion changes nothing. Without an approved skeletal framework, your nervous system has nothing to connect to. Mason answered immediately. Then stop trying to give it a skeleton. Silence settled over the chamber. Even Olivia felt her heartbeat speed up because she knew that tone. Mason only sounded that calm when an impossible idea had already taken shape inside his head. Cale studied him for several long seconds before speaking. Very well. Since you reject every established solution, tomorrow morning you may review the complete structural archive of our cybernetic division. Olivia looked at Mason in surprise. Cale's eyes narrowed. Not because I expect you to succeed. Because I want you to understand exactly why you cannot. As security drones escorted Mason's bed back toward the medical wing, Olivia whispered, Do you really think there is something in those files? Mason stared through the window at the endless lights of the orbital station. No. She blinked. Then what are we looking for? A slow grin appeared across his face. Proof that every one of them has been asking the wrong question. Mason spent the next morning inside the restricted cybernetics archive, a place few patients had ever seen and even fewer had been invited into. Olivia rolled his medical chair through rows of suspended holographic servers while translucent blue displays filled the room from floor to ceiling. Every breakthrough in alien cybernetic medicine was cataloged there. Every artificial limb, every reinforced spine, every synthetic joint perfected over thousands of years. Dr. Cale Voss stood near the entrance with his hands folded behind his back. You have access until 1800 hours, he said evenly. Review whatever you wish. You will reach the same conclusion as every expert before you. Mason nodded without looking at him. We will see. Cale walked away, convinced the experiment was already over. Olivia leaned closer. Where do we even start? Mason answered immediately. Failure reports. She blinked. Not the successful procedures? Success teaches you what works. Failure teaches you why everyone keeps making the same mistake. She smiled despite herself and began filtering thousands of records. Hours passed as Mason studied reconstruction after reconstruction. Different species, different injuries, different technologies. Yet every solution followed the same philosophy. Preserve the original biology. Restore the original shape. Return the patient to factory settings. Mason rubbed his forehead. There it is again. Olivia enlarged another report. Another collapsed spinal lattice? No. He pointed to a single sentence buried in the technical notes. Structural geometry preserved whenever possible. Olivia read it twice before looking back at him. You think that is the problem? Mason slowly rotated the holographic skeleton floating between them. Every single engineer in history knows that when a design fails under new conditions, Preserving the old geometry becomes the biggest limitation. He highlighted the human femur. This bone evolved to support a biological body under Earth gravity. Now we expect it to survive exosuits, artificial muscles, orbital construction work, and alien environments. We keep asking old bones to do new jobs. Olivia stared at the model as the idea slowly settled in. So the skeleton is not broken because of the accident. Mason nodded. The accident exposed weaknesses that were already there. Before either of them could continue, another hologram appeared automatically. Access restricted. Black archive. Authorization denied. Mason frowned. What is that? Olivia searched the system. There are no file names. Just encrypted engineering records. Mason looked toward the security cameras mounted along the ceiling. Interesting. Do not even think about it, Olivia whispered. Those files are classified. Exactly. Mason, if they are hiding something from their own engineers, then it matters. Olivia hesitated. Every sensible part of her wanted to leave the archive before security noticed them lingering near restricted systems. But she had worked beside Mason for years. She knew that expression. It always appeared a few minutes before he solved something everyone else believed impossible. Quiet footsteps echoed behind them. A young alien research assistant carrying data modules stopped beside the terminal, glanced at Mason's display, and lowered his voice. You are looking in the wrong archive. Mason slowly turned toward him. What do you mean? The assistant looked nervously over his shoulder before answering. The first-generation cybernetic project was abandoned almost 300 years ago. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, he swallowed. They stopped because the prototypes were becoming stronger than the people they were supposed to heal. Before Mason could ask another question, red security lights suddenly flashed across the archive walls. A calm synthetic voice filled the room. Unauthorized inquiry into restricted engineering records detected. Security personnel have been notified. Olivia looked at Mason with wide eyes. Tell me you did not trigger that. Mason never took his eyes off the sealed black archive icon glowing in front of him. No, he said quietly. Someone else just noticed we started asking the right question. The archive doors had barely begun to seal when two station security drones dropped from hidden ceiling panels with a sharp mechanical hiss. Blue containment lights swept across the room. Remain where you are. Unauthorized access investigation in progress. Olivia instinctively stepped in front of Mason's chair. We are not running, she said. Mason kept watching the black archive icon slowly disappear from the main display. No, he answered quietly. But somebody else is trying very hard to make sure we stop asking questions. The young research assistant who had warned them looked terrified. He lowered his data modules onto the nearest console and whispered, I should never have said anything. Before anyone could respond, another alarm sounded from deeper inside the archive. A maintenance robot suddenly rolled across the floor, then jerked violently as its control lights flashed red. One machine became 3, then 5. Their programming had been overwritten, and they began sealing security doors throughout the wing. Hospital staff scattered into nearby offices as emergency shutters slammed down one after another. Olivia looked around in disbelief. That is not standard security. Mason narrowed his eyes. No, somebody just turned a routine investigation into a lockdown. One drone rotated toward the malfunctioning machines. Containment breach detected. It accelerated across the room, colliding with one rogue maintenance unit, and sending both skidding across the polished floor in a shower of harmless sparks and shattered plastic panels. More robots rolled out from side corridors, blocking every exit. The archive echoed with warning tones as shelves automatically retracted into armored vaults to protect centuries of research. Olivia grabbed the controls on Mason's chair. We need another way out. Left hallway. Mason answered immediately. Maintenance access. How do you know? Engineers always notice service doors before decorations. She pushed the chair as fast as the electric motors allowed. A damaged robot slid into their path, extending a repair arm that locked across the corridor like a steel barrier. Olivia froze. Mason reached toward a loose diagnostic cable hanging from the side of his chair. Hand me that connector. Seriously? Trust me. She pulled it free. Mason plugged the cable into the robot's exposed maintenance port, typed 3 commands using the bedside interface attached to his chair, and waited. The robot stopped moving. 1 second later, it quietly folded its arm out of the hallway. Olivia stared at him. You just hacked hospital equipment from a patient bed. Mason shrugged. They left the factory password unchanged. They continued down the narrow service corridor while security drones battled malfunctioning machines behind them, filling the distance with flashing lights and metallic impacts. No one was injured, but the confusion spread through the medical complex faster than anyone could control it. They finally reached a small observation deck overlooking the station's engineering ring. Through the massive window, thousands of technicians worked around rotating support structures nearly a quarter-mile across. Mason studied the framework in silence. Olivia caught her breath beside him. We almost got trapped back there. That was never about us, Mason replied. It was about those files. Before she could ask another question, the young research assistant hurried into the observation deck, breathing hard. He looked over both shoulders before speaking. They erased the access logs already. Mason frowned. That fast? The assistant nodded. Whatever was hidden in the first-generation project, someone with authority does not want anyone connecting it to you. Mason turned back toward the giant structural framework outside the window. The support beams stretched through open space in elegant geometric patterns unlike anything inside a human body. His eyes slowly widened. Olivia noticed the change immediately. What is it? Mason smiled for the first time since the accident. I have been looking at skeletons for 2 days. He pointed through the glass at the enormous orbital structure. When the answer has been hanging outside the window the whole time. Mason could not stop staring at the orbital support ring outside the observation window. Every beam carried stress differently. No single piece tried to bear the entire load. The weight flowed through thousands of interconnected paths until the whole structure became stronger than any individual part. Olivia followed his gaze. You were thinking about replacing bones with a framework. Mason slowly nodded. Not replacing. Rethinking. The young research assistant looked confused. A biological skeleton needs joints. Mason smiled. A human skeleton does. A structural frame only needs stability. He asked Olivia to bring up the station's engineering schematics instead of medical records. Within seconds, a rotating model filled the air between them. Mason zoomed into the internal truss network supporting one of the docking arms. Look here. If one support fails, the load shifts automatically through the rest of the frame. Olivia folded her arms. Like a suspension bridge. Exactly. Mason enlarged his own skeletal skin beside it. The difference was impossible to ignore. His body depended on a handful of major bones carrying enormous forces through predictable directions. The station spread those same forces through dozens of redundant pathways. Nobody ever designed the human body for orbital construction work, Mason said quietly. Evolution only had to keep us alive on Earth. The assistant hesitated before asking, Are you saying you want your skeleton to behave like a space station? Mason laughed for the first time since the accident. When you say it out loud, it sounds a little crazy. Olivia smirked. Only a little. Before Mason could answer, every engineering display suddenly disappeared. A new authorization screen replaced them. Access revoked. Project privileges terminated. Seconds later, Dr. Cale Voss walked onto the observation deck with 2 administrative officers. His expression remained calm, but there was a sharpness in his voice that had not been there before. Mr. Carter, your archive privileges have ended. Mason looked at him. Interesting timing. You have caused enough disruption for 1 day. Cale handed Olivia an official notice. Effective immediately, no hospital equipment may be used for unauthorized engineering projects involving this patient. Olivia scanned the document. You suspended my research access? Temporarily. For reading engineering files? For encouraging false hope. Mason remained surprisingly relaxed. You really believe I am dangerous? Cale answered without hesitation. No. I believe desperate people make reckless decisions. My responsibility is preventing another tragedy. Mason held his gaze. And mine is solving the problem everyone else already gave up on. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Olivia could feel the entire conversation had shifted. This was no longer doctor versus patient. It was engineer versus institution. Cale finally turned to leave. Tomorrow morning your transfer paperwork will be completed. You will enter long-term adaptive care. After he disappeared down the corridor, Olivia looked at Mason in disbelief. If they transfer you, this is over. Mason remained silent for several seconds before asking a completely unexpected question. How much scrap titanium is stored in Maintenance Sector 12? Olivia blinked. Why would you ask that? The young assistant answered first. Roughly 1,200 pounds waiting for recycling. Mason slowly smiled. Perfect. Olivia stared at him. Perfect for what? Mason looked through the observation window one last time before turning his chair toward the maintenance elevators. If the hospital will not let me build inside their laboratory, then we are going to build somewhere they stopped paying attention years ago. As the elevator doors opened, the assistant hesitated only a moment before stepping inside with them, quietly leaving behind his security badge on the observation deck floor, knowing there would be no turning back after this. Maintenance Sector 12 sat beneath the polished medical levels like the forgotten basement of a luxury hotel. Nobody came there unless something broke, and that was exactly why Mason wanted it. Old fabrication tables, retired construction drones, stacks of titanium tubing, and discarded structural braces filled the enormous workshop. Olivia pushed Mason's chair through the dim warehouse while the young research assistant, who finally introduced himself as Noah Pierce, unlocked a storage cage with an outdated mechanical key. Nobody checks inventory down here for weeks, Noah said quietly. As long as nothing leaves the station, no one notices. Mason looked around the room like a kid walking into his favorite hardware store. This is better than a laboratory. Olivia laughed. Only you would say that surrounded by scrap metal. Noah placed several engineering tablets across the workbench. I copied everything I could before my access disappeared. Mason immediately began sketching over the digital blueprints with his finger. He ignored every medical diagram and focused entirely on geometry, force distribution, and connection points. Forget bones, he murmured. Think bridge. Think crane. Think spacecraft. Olivia watched line after line appear across the screen. The familiar human skeleton slowly disappeared beneath an intricate lattice of triangular supports and flexible anchor rings. You are building something that has never existed, she whispered. Mason nodded. Exactly. If I copy nature, I inherit its limits. If I design from physics, I only answer to gravity. Hours passed unnoticed. Noah assembled miniature structural models with the station's fabrication printer, while Olivia calculated stress loads using engineering software instead of medical simulations. The first prototype was barely the size of a backpack, but when Mason applied virtual force through the simulator, the framework redirected pressure exactly as he predicted. Olivia looked up in disbelief. It is holding 30% more load than the biological model. Mason smiled. And we have not even optimized it. Suddenly, every screen in the workshop went black. The fabrication printer stopped in the middle of its cycle. Emergency lights flickered overhead. Noah checked his terminal. The network is gone. The main cargo door slid open with a heavy mechanical rumble. Dr. Cale Voss stepped inside accompanied by station administrators and maintenance supervisors rather than security officers. His expression remained calm, almost disappointed. I was hoping you would choose to rest. Mason leaned back in his chair. You tracked the fabrication request. No, Cale answered. I tracked Olivia's access badge. You were never hiding from me. Olivia lowered her eyes, realizing she had unknowingly led them there. Cale walked slowly around the unfinished prototype resting on the workbench. He studied every connection without touching it. Ingenious, he admitted. Structurally elegant, but completely unauthorized. Mason looked surprised. You understand it? Of course I do. I was an engineer before I became a physician. That answer hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Noah frowned. Then why stop us? Cale finally looked directly at Mason. Because I have already watched this idea fail once. He tapped a command onto his wrist interface. Hidden projectors activated around the room, revealing faded holographic footage from nearly 3 centuries earlier. Another engineer stood beside a metallic internal framework almost identical to Mason's design. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Olivia slowly turned toward Mason. Someone already built it. Cale nodded once. And the project nearly changed our civilization forever. Mason stared silently at the forgotten recording as the prototype engineer smiled into the camera and said the exact words Mason himself had spoken only hours before. Do not repair the skeleton. Replace the idea of one. The workshop fell completely silent as the century-old recording continued to play across the holographic wall. The alien engineer smiled with the same quiet confidence Mason had carried since the accident. Behind him stood a prototype internal framework that looked less like a skeleton and more like the structural core of an orbital station. Olivia slowly looked from the recording back to Mason. "You were not the first." Mason shook his head. "No, but I might be the first to ask why it disappeared." Dr. Cale Voss stepped closer to the projector. His voice carried none of the arrogance Mason had heard in the hospital. His name was Dr. Sorrentau. He was the brightest structural engineer our civilization ever produced. He believed biology should adapt to engineering instead of forcing engineering to imitate biology. Noah frowned. "Then why erase his work?" Cale let out a long breath. "Because he succeeded too well." The room grew quiet again. Cale expanded another archive. Thousands of engineering reports filled the air. Images showed volunteers walking again after catastrophic injuries, workers lifting loads that normally required powered exosuits, rescue crews surviving dangerous environments without heavy support equipment. Olivia whispered, "These are incredible." "They were," Cale replied, "until every government in the coalition wanted exclusive control over the technology." Mason studied the reports carefully. There were no signs of failed engineering, no catastrophic collapse, no hidden disaster. "This project did not end because it failed," he said. Cale slowly nodded. "It ended because it changed the balance of power." Noah looked stunned. "So the medical council buried it?" "The entire coalition agreed to classify it. Every copy was sealed. Every laboratory was closed. We decided some inventions should wait until society was ready." Mason could not hide a small smile. That is usually what people say when they are afraid of progress. Cale did not argue. "Perhaps." Mason rolled closer to the unfinished prototype resting on the workbench. He compared its geometry with Sorrentau's original framework. At first glance, they looked almost identical. Then he noticed one critical difference. His expression changed instantly. Olivia caught it. "What did you find?" Mason enlarged both designs side by side. "Look at the load distribution." Noah leaned in. "I do not see it." Mason highlighted several connection points. Soren built a perfect structure. "Too perfect." Olivia looked confused. "How can something be too perfect?" Mason smiled. "Because every part depends on every other part. If one connection fails, the entire frame loses efficiency." He quickly drew new support paths across his own design. Engineers on Earth learned that lesson a long time ago. Bridges survive because they expect failure. Airplanes keep flying because they assume something will eventually break. Redundancy is not wasted material. It is what keeps people alive. Cale stared at the revised model without saying a word. The framework immediately became more complex, but also stronger. Independent load paths formed throughout the structure like a living network instead of a rigid frame. Olivia slowly stepped back. "You just solved the weakness in a design that has been locked away for 300 years. Mason looked at Cale. "Your civilization stopped because it found the first answer. Human engineers keep asking the second question." Cale lowered his eyes to the revised blueprint. For the first time since they met, genuine uncertainty crossed his face. Then the workshop speakers suddenly came alive with an urgent station-wide announcement. "Attention, all departments. Emergency structural failure detected in docking ring 3. Engineering teams report increasing instability. Immediate response required." Noah turned toward the ceiling. "That ring supports nearly half the commercial traffic." Mason was already looking at the giant framework displayed on the wall. Then he quietly said the words that made Olivia realize exactly what he intended to do next. "Good. We finally have something big enough to prove this works. : Docking ring 3 was already surrounded by emergency crews when Mason, Olivia, Noah, and Dr. Cale Voss arrived at the engineering control deck. Hundreds of technicians watched enormous structural displays that shifted from green to flashing amber every few seconds. One of the station supervisors pointed toward the central projection. "Support Truss 17 is transferring more load than it was ever designed to carry. If we shut the ring down, we trap thousands of travelers. If we leave it running, the stress keeps climbing." Mason studied the live model for less than 30 seconds before shaking his head. "You are looking at the wrong failure." The supervisor frowned. "Excuse me." Mason pointed toward 3 distant support nodes. Everybody is staring at the overloaded beam because that is where the alarm started. The real problem began over there 6 minutes earlier. The room became quiet. Several engineers quickly replayed the telemetry logs. One by one, the graphs confirmed Mason's observation. A tiny support assembly had gradually drifted out of alignment long before the larger beam reached its limit. Olivia smiled. Chain reaction. Mason nodded. Structures almost never fail where people first notice them. Dr. Cale Voss folded his arms while watching the analysis unfold. He had expected Mason to offer bold theories. Instead, he was diagnosing a station built by civilizations thousands of years older than Earth. The chief engineer looked at Mason. Can you stabilize it? Mason answered honestly. Not with the current design. A disappointed murmur spread across the room until he continued. But you can redirect the load. He asked for a construction stylus and began sketching directly over the station blueprint. Instead of reinforcing the damaged beam, he added temporary cross braces that created multiple alternate force paths through neighboring structures. Noah stared at the drawing. That is almost identical to your internal framework. Mason smiled. Because the laws of physics do not care whether they are holding up a space station or a person. The engineering team rushed to simulate the proposal. Every screen updated simultaneously. The warning indicators slowly changed from red to amber, then from amber to green. One technician looked back in disbelief. Stress dropped by 42% without replacing a single support beam. Another engineer whispered, "We have been trying to strengthen the weak point." He strengthened everything around it instead. Dr. Cale Voss quietly lowered his eyes. In that moment, he finally understood why Mason's design had felt different from the beginning. It was never about making one bone stronger. It was about creating a system that refused to depend on one bone at all. The station supervisor turned toward Mason. Would this same principle work inside a human body? Before Mason could answer, Cale stepped forward. No. Everyone looked at him. He took a slow breath before continuing. It would not work inside a human body. Olivia frowned. You just watched it solve the station. Cale looked directly at Mason. Because he is no longer designing a human body. Mason held his gaze without speaking. Cale walked toward the unfinished prototype displayed on Mason's tablet and carefully placed his hand beside it. This is something entirely new. The room fell silent again. There was no fear in Cale's voice anymore. Only reluctant respect. He looked at Mason and quietly said, "If we continue, there is no guarantee history will remember this as medicine. It may remember it as the beginning of a new branch of engineering." Mason looked down at the blueprint for several long seconds before slowly closing the tablet. Then he smiled and answered with complete certainty. Good. Because I never came here to repair what I used to be. I came here to build what comes next. 3 weeks later, the central auditorium of the Galactic Cybernetics Institute was filled beyond capacity. Engineers, physicians, military observers, university researchers, and council delegates packed every seat. Nobody had gathered to witness a miracle. They had come expecting to watch a desperate Terran fail one last time. Mason Carter waited behind a quiet set of sliding doors while technicians completed the final systems check. Olivia stood beside him holding the same tablet she had carried since the first night in the hospital. Noah smiled nervously. There are more cameras in this room than I have ever seen. Mason chuckled. Good. Then nobody can pretend this never happened. The door opened. Hundreds of conversations faded into silence as Mason rolled onto the demonstration platform. Dr. Cale Voss walked to the center of the stage and addressed the audience. Several weeks ago, this patient was declared permanently beyond reconstruction under every recognized cybernetic standard. Today, we are not here to celebrate certainty. We are here because certainty deserves to be questioned. A technician disconnected the support systems from Mason's chair. The room held its breath. Mason looked toward Olivia. She nodded once. Whenever you are ready. He reached for the release controls attached to the chair and quietly pressed them. For one long second, nothing happened. Then the newly built internal framework responded exactly as it had inside every simulation. Mason stood. No dramatic music. No triumphant celebration. Just one ordinary human being taking one ordinary step after everyone had agreed it would never happen again. He took another step. Then another. Calm. Balanced. Steady. The audience remained completely silent. Engineers leaned forward. Doctors forgot to write notes. Council delegates simply stared. Mason crossed the platform without rushing, stopped beside the large structural model of Docking Ring 3, and rested one hand against it. Everybody keeps asking whether this frame is stronger than a skeleton, he said. That is the wrong question. He looked around the room before continuing. The better question is why we believed one answer had to last forever. Dr. Cale Voss slowly walked onto the stage beside him. He held a small data chip in his hand. 300 years ago, he said, our civilization buried the work of Dr. Soren Tao because we feared what it might become. Today I have the opportunity to make a different choice. He placed the chip into the public archive terminal. Every classified record connected to the Forgotten Project instantly became available across the Coalition Research Network. Audible gasps echoed through the auditorium. Noah looked at Cale in disbelief. You released everything? Cale nodded. Knowledge hidden by fear eventually becomes ignorance. I have no interest in passing that mistake to another generation. Olivia smiled at Mason. Looks like you changed more than one mind. Mason laughed softly. No, I just asked a different question. As people surrounded the stage, eager to study the new framework, Mason quietly stepped away from the crowd and looked out through the massive observation window toward the stars. The station still stood because engineers had chosen to redesign the path of the load instead of blaming the weakest beam. He realized people were not much different. Life would eventually place more weight on every person than they expected. Some would spend years trying to become who they used to be. Others would discover the courage to become someone entirely new. Mason smiled to himself as Olivia joined him by the window. So, she asked, what are you building next? He looked toward the endless lights scattered across the galaxy and answered with the same calm confidence that had carried him from a hospital bed to this moment. Hopefully a future where nobody is afraid to improve something just because it has always been done the old way. That is the best thing any engineer can leave behind.